Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel. I'm really excited to be here with everyone. We have some really fantastic panelists today. We're going to talk about fast fashion and overconsumption. So I'll let everyone introduce themselves. Elizabeth, you're at the top of my screen, so let's start with you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Cline. I'm a journalist, the author of 2 books, The Conscious Closet and Overdressed, and since the start of the pandemic, a campaigner for the PAYUP fashion campaign.
Great, thanks for being here. And sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I am Rachel Cernansky. I'm the sustainability editor at Vogue Business. Sorry about that. Brittany, you're up next.
Cool, sure. So thanks for having me today or this evening. I'm in Amsterdam. So I'm Brittany. I'm the Director of Strategy at Fashion for Good. We're a global initiative set up to drive practical solutions to some of the industry's biggest challenges. So we look at things on the business to business side through innovation with startups, but then we also look at it through the eyes of the consumer. So in order to do this, we have a ton of different activities we do. We run an innovation platform, a good fashion fund, as well as an experience, which is our fancy way of saying a museum. These seem like disparate activities, but we think that change comes from many different directions, especially in a fragmented industry like ours, and it won't be solved in a silo. So we try for an approach that shines light on all the different solutions available, and so that we can enable kind of small steps in the right direction. And I think probably the main takeaway is the spoiler alert, there is no silver bullet to fixing everything, but I think today's discussion will lead us down a few different interesting paths on potential opportunities to explore. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks for being here. And Orsola?
I am Orsola de Castro, and I am the co-founder and creative director at Fashion Revolution. Fashion Revolution is a global campaign, a movement of activists in fashion. We have a presence in 92 countries. I also very much work as a mentor for emerging designers and emerging brands, as a teacher in several universities throughout the world, talking about how to enter a world where fashion and society are indeed more sustainable.
Great, thank you. And Aja, I know you you're fresh off another panel, so I hope you're not talked out, but
I'm fresh off a Vogue business panel. My name is Aja Barber. I am a writer and consultant, and mostly I'm known for microblogging on Instagram, but I run a platform on Patreon as well. And I talk about sustainability and ethical fashion, but I use links to intersectional feminism and how, the fashion industry can be linked to so many other societal issues that we talk about in other spaces. And so my work mainly deals in getting people to draw those connections and think about those connections when they think about their wardrobes and how they're consuming.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for being here. Let's get started. So I thought we could start by talking just about, the current moment we're in. So Elizabeth, I think let's start with you again. Will the economic woes of the pandemic, do you think, impact the future of sustainability in fashion, and how?
It's such a big question, and I'm super excited to hear what everybody else thinks. I remember when it first started to unfold back in March and April, every panel I was on, we were sort of speculating about where fashion was headed. And now we're sort of starting to see, but I think even now we don't really know, that we're probably, we are already headed into a global recession, which is going to fundamentally change the way people shop. And then there's this bigger question of what's going to happen to supply chains. And I think that what I could potentially offer on this part of the conversation is that I think that the conversation that consumers are having about what they want to happen is really different from the conversation that brands are having about saving their businesses. You know, they're looking at every way possible to cut costs and to increase supply chain agility, which to me means they're imposing more flexibility on factories, which is going to have downward pressure on labor rights. But that, I mean, that's just like kind of an opening thought that I have.
Does anyone else want to add to that? Because that's, I mean, that's such a key, you know, issue that's bubbling to the surface. Consumers say they want sustainability, and especially in the pandemic, there's a lot of, you know, sentiment that sustainability is more important than ever as we sort of re-embrace our values and things. But then there's also, you know, the economic realities.
I think we're already seeing it bite, to be honest. I mean, you know, when it comes to young designers, emerging designers, small businesses, you know, they really are struggling right now under our very noses, as are, as always, the poorest in society. So the supply chain workers and the people who do the hard graft most of the time. So to think that, you know, a global recession and pandemic is suddenly going to wake us all up to, you know, some sort of recycled rainbow of well-doing and well-being, that's just not going to happen, which is why we have to, as a society, increment our vigilance, because the people that are hidden from us and the ones that are likely to be hurt the most are always the least visible. So I feel that this particular industry is based on foundations that are beyond wrong and beyond unsustainable, and that, you know, really they have a massive obligation to look at what they've built and change it. It's hard to move a massive industry, this giant that there is, and we will all have, as citizens, a really huge responsibility to keep them up to scrutiny and to ensure that, you know, right now they promise the bloody earth to sell some more clothes. You know, it's the sustainability this and the I've, you know, published that and, you know, anything. But the truth is that we as consumers are not really in the habit of making sure that those claims are real. So in that sense, as consumers, we have to keep vigilance up, because we know that the poorest are in more danger than before.
One thing that I'm seeing already in my own platform is people have been forced to slow down. And I've never been one to sign on to a universal boycott of the fashion industry. I actually love the fashion industry. I want to see it survive, but I don't want to see it look like any of its current iteration, basically. The future of what I want does not look like what we currently have. And so in people being sort of, I would say, forced to slow down, we're not going out as much. Like I have been known to wear the same outfit 3-4 days in a row lately. I think people have really started to sort of reevaluate their values and to, you know, think more about what we're buying and what we're buying into. And I get a lot of very positive, uplifting messages from people that will say, you know, I've really, really slowed down. Like when I first found your platform, I was really in it. And at first I felt a bit negative about some of the things that you were saying. And then I started to listen, and then I started to realize, why am I buying like this? And now what I've found is in this pause that has happened during the pandemic, I find that people are more actually inclined to take the money that they would have spent on fast fashion and say, send me a message that says, look, I bought this dress from like a really ethical designer. And before I would have said, oh, I can never afford that. But because I'm not buying 5 things a month, actually, I can put my money into one good product. And I've never actually felt that sort of conversation coming from as many people before. And that feels like a step in the right direction, not to like Pollyanna all of this, because I know we're entering a global recession. As we know, garment workers are still really out of luck because of the brands, and we have to hold them to account for that. But I think that we're moving into a direction where people before that would have stuck their fingers in their ears and gone la 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 are actually really kind of listening and starting to see what many of us have been banging on about for years. And I think that that ultimately is it leaves me feeling motivated and inspired in a lot of ways.
I'm glad you raised those points, Aja, because I'll circle back, but it sort of sparked a thought of a story that that I wrote last week about or I guess I forget, one of the last 2 weeks was about sort of what's been missing from fashion sustainability goals. And someone made a really interesting connection between how low workers' wages are to the ability of the industry to overproduce, because if the cost of labor is low, there's sort of no incentive to not overproduce and to just sort of produce as much as possible and see what sells. And so, but this question about, buying less, like, and spending more on one thing rather than less on 5 things, that requires a change in business models to, for brands to succeed in this like sort of new way of operating. And that's happening to some degree with some brands. Are you all seeing, I don't know, an acceleration of like brands looking at how to really change? Because it really is a question about business models, in addition to, all these other issues. Are you seeing brands sort of?
I would say I'm not seeing enough from the big brands. I would say the brands that were already moving in that direction before the pandemic are doing it. They're doing it, and I'm giving them their due because I think it's worth it. The big brands are kind of hoping that, like, I think everyone's just going to forget about this and go back to business as normal. I mean, I can't think of a single brand on the high street that is doing anything that's, worth applauding at all. I can think of some brands that are doing a lot of greenwashing. But I think that the people that were already moving in the right direction felt more urgency to do so. And the people that continue to greenwash are just doing business as normal, hoping that this will sort of die down in the general public.
Yeah, I would absolutely second Aja, and maybe take it even a little further and say that, actually the vital equation between quality of product and quality of life for the person who made those products is really not registering at all. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's interesting that, some people are slowing down, but as we all know, it's there's also an awful lot of people who are sort of speeding up and using this staying at home as a way to actually buy even more. The problem is this balance in between, the quantity in front of the types of quantities that we are seeing now. And until that is arrested, and until it's seen that, the quality of product needs to match the working life of the person, that garment workers and supply chain workers need to be paid decently and by the hour rather than frantically and by the piece. Until we just stop that monster, we can talk about it until I come home. But
Ursula, I generally feel like those brands that you're talking about will not change until consumer trust leaves them, until the bottom line leaves them. I don't think that there's any incentive for some of these brands to think, oh, we really have to rethink this business model. And so if I can be so honest, I'm not rooting for them to come out of this looking good. I'm rooting for the small brands and the brands that have really made an effort. And I would not give that to a lot of the big brands at all.
Well, that's a good segue. Oh, sorry. I don't know who was just trying to talk.
Oh, it was me. I was just going to say, to kind of round it off from a little bit of a different angle. So I think mainly I'm putting my Fashion for Good hat on here. So one of the reasons why we exist is to explore the alternatives to the status quo and figure out what is viable. So, what new materials are available? How can we better forecast our demand so that we stop that overproduction or excess stock? What kind of technology can enable rental or circular business models? And I think all of these things have been a priority, certainly, But I think if there was one positive to kind of come out of these turbulent times that we live in, is a lot of this has been accelerated. The pace of change has been rapidly, kind of, we're fast forwarding, if you will, especially when you look at some of the digital solutions for the industry. So while I agree, there are parts of the supply chain there is certainly a lot to be done. There are some parts that we are seeing a bit more faster acceleration because of the current conditions. So if there's one kind of maybe optimistic point, I think that's that may be one of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would like to jump in on this too. I think for me, with the pandemic and working on the PAYUP campaign, I sort of have reached a breaking point with the idea of needing more awareness raising to fix what's going on with the big brands. Because you can see in the contracts that they have with their suppliers that the whole system is set up to push risk down the supply chain. So for me, one of the things we're trying to do with the campaign is look at the mechanisms that kind of control pricing over the big brands and start to change that. So that can really mean like reforming supply chain regulations and like changing labor laws so that brands are responsible for what happens in factories. I think that where we get ourselves into trouble is thinking that the reason why things don't change is because we don't have enough people who care. Plenty of people care about this. Everybody cares about it, but it doesn't change because there aren't any regulations in place to change it. And I also think that the ethical fashion community shouldn't ignore what's happening in the mainstream industry because something like 20 brands control 97% of the profits in the industry. So, these are the companies that make most of the world's clothes. So I think that we have to come up with solutions that apply to the big companies as well.
Mm-hmm. So this I think is a good sort of intro into another topic that I wanted to make sure we all address, the kind of who bears responsibility for driving the sort of change in environmental and labor practices in the industry, and just the quantities of production. Is it there's a lot of talk about ethical consumption and the role of the consumer. There's also the brands, and there's also a role for regulators. Brittany, I know Fashion for Good does some work, touching on some of these. Where does the responsibility lie?
So I think it's depending on who you ask, you'll probably get different answers. And I think that everyone has a part to play in kind of what proportion of the pie they are. I think everyone would have different opinions. When I think of the industry side of things, like, kind of the brands and the manufacturers and the suppliers, I think it also depends on where they are in kind of, we often talk about a maturity curve for sustainable innovation. Have they, are they new on this journey? Are they very advanced? Where do they sit on this curve? And what we try to do is move more folks up that curve, and create enablement moments to do just that. So, are they disclosing their suppliers? Are they using responsible materials and production techniques? Are they, again, getting to that forecasting question and the circular business models? You can kind of see all of these things as almost, and maybe this is dumbing it down too much, but you almost look at all these things as ingredients that the industry has at their disposal, and it's up to them to decide how they want to combine them and what they want to produce. And at the end of the day, it's up to the consumers to decide, do they have the appetite for it? And I know that's kind of very much simplifying a very complex problem, but I think it's perhaps one way to look at it.
I want to jump in and say something to tack on to what you just said and what Elizabeth just said. I think that we keep doing this thing where we leave it so that the brands can regulate themselves. And I don't think that they should be allowed to do that, because if they were able to do that, we wouldn't have had, fire after fire, factory collapse, that sort of thing. It just keeps happening. Finding a big old bag of tags in the middle of, some nature reserve, it's just, it's one of those things. And I listened in on the recent sustainability summit, and it seems like time and time again, the big brands are like, oh yeah, we're going to all get together on this initiative, which has absolutely no legality. It has nothing behind it. And then it dissolves in a few years, and everyone's like, but it was a moment for everyone to look really good in the spotlight. And unfortunately, when it comes to the consumer, I think the general education surrounding these topics is lacking for consumers. People can't tell the difference between greenwashing, hogwash, and what is real. And so I think that there's a real need for some sort of regulatory body, because I don't think that this industry should be regulating itself, just like I would not want the fossil fuel industry regulating itself. I think there's we can only put so much responsibility on the consumer. Obviously, the conversation around consumption needs to be having in all spaces. I think children should learn about these things in school, to be honest. But then that kind of goes against capitalism and a lot of the stuff that we're brought up to be taught. So, but I think that putting so much responsibility on the consumer is a part of the problem, and allowing brands to continue to self-regulate is definitely a part of the problem.
Totally. I mean, I definitely think, the fashion industry should be regulated as food is and pharmaceutical is. I mean, it's as simple as that. Why isn't, and yet why do government keep projecting ways to make, transparency and public disclosure mandatory, and, so that we can have this supply chain visibility? Exactly. That's where we are. But the reality is that if, again, apologies for being everybody's grandmother, but, when the global industry moved to kind of far away shores, then developing countries, they did so cynically. They did so because the regulations to actually look after leather and its, supply chain and workers and so on and so forth cost an awful lot of money. But there are pockets of real integrity, the Made in Italy, for instance, and, manufacturing had a moment of its glory. The minute it left, they could have had an opportunity to say, okay, we're going to bring new jobs, new, good, decent jobs. We can look at it from an environmental perspective, bring in all the things that we've learned, because we've learned so much in 200 years of, industrialization. And we brought all the know-how and all of the worst possible exploitation. And the reality is that, it is absolutely true that we need to rely on governments in order to regulate. But the brands who have, for so many years, profited so much, they have to pay the price, so to speak, redistribute those earnings throughout their supply chain, invest in those people that they have so far exploited.
Absolutely. And first of all, nobody moves overseas to be altruistic in what they're doing. That's just that is a lie that the industry milks again and again, and it needs to stop. You did not move overseas to give those nice people jobs. You moved overseas because there's a lack of regulation. You can make a product for super cheap. That's the end of it. But also, I think that if everybody wanted the same thing in the fashion industry, there would be no billionaires at the top. That is the crux of the problem, is that there are so many people making so much money, and the people who are actually doing the most backbreaking labor are making pennies. And if we all wanted the same thing, the people at the top would not be able to sleep at night with the profits that they have been making for the last 20 years. They wouldn't. I couldn't live with myself if I did that. I would feel horrific. And so I don't think that these brands want the same thing as me, because I want them to stop being billionaires and treat people fairly. And it doesn't seem like they want that.
Let's, I feel like we could talk about that question for a long time, but let's move on to, there was a really great question just came up in the from the audience. So I'm going to sort of jump around from other questions that we were going to talk about. Can you speak on best practices to decolonize international activism towards ethical and sustainable fashion, especially in a movement that is majority white women-led, advocating for justice for POCs abroad? Who Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can take that. Well, it's decolonizing fashion is, it's a sort of a topic that if you study the history of fashion and fast fashion, anyone that knows, you understand that that the whole root of cheap fashion and fast fashion lies in colonization. And to a certain extent, all the movements that have come, activism movement that have come after have been, in a way, weirdly emulating the same thing that you want to antagonize. It is absolutely true that the majority of environmental movements, or look at fashion revolution to a certain extent, they do end up looking just like me. What we try as a campaign, because we have country coordinators in so many countries over the world, is to make their voices as heard as possible, because we understand that the fashion issues are different each place you are in the world. So with Fashion Revolution, we try to look at really what is important in the countries where we have the coordinators, what are the topics, and make sure that they shout about that as loud as they can with their community. And we provide the international community that they can also reach by being with Fashion Revolution. But this is a massive cultural change, and God bless, in a way, the moment when we started putting everything into question. Because until you really understand that we are not being taught the truth from the very start, whether it's at school or in marketing or, in the television that we see every day, when you realize as a big, global community that you've been duped. And when those kids start waking up in the morning saying, hey, hang on a second, I understand, I want to study more, I want to learn more, because they realize that they've only been sold half of the story, that's when you will get to see the bigger changes also at the top.
Does anyone else want to add to that question about decolonizing the activism within sustainable fashion?
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like we need more voices of people of color. I mean, I feel like I get invited on a lot of stuff because there's not enough of us, and I want there to be, more marginalized people. I mean, the amount of times I participate in a panel, but there's no garment workers present. You know what I mean? Like, this is literally about garment workers, ultimately. And it just seems like there's not enough inclusion happening from the people who are doing the hardest work. And in general, I think we have to decolonize all of our spaces, not just the fashion industry, but that starts with a much larger conversation, which I would not be able to cover at all today. But just in general, more diverse voices in all spaces is first and foremost.
Right. Yeah.
I can build on that too with so with the PAYUP fashion campaign, seven demands for a worker-centric future of fashion. That plan was co-written by the AWAJ Foundation and Stand Up Lanka. And then one of the demands is for anytime there's a conference or any sort of brand-led conversation about sustainable fashion, that there need to be garment workers included. Actually, to Sustainable Fashion Forum's credit, you guys took that demand and ran with it and started organizing panels around garment worker voices. And we had took that same demand along with Clean Clothes campaign to the Copenhagen Fashion Summit. And they too changed some of their programming to better, to make it more inclusive of people from the supply chain. So it feels like it's starting to happen, but it's like, it's not enough.
You mentioned Copenhagen and that same story that I wrote recently that I referenced before. It was about the voices missing from fashion sustainability goals, and I talked to Morten Lemon from Fashion, the Global Fashion Agenda, which puts on the summit, and he acknowledged that they have had plenty of room to sort of grow in terms of being more inclusive, and said that the agenda for the Copenhagen Fashion Summit would show that effort. So I'm curious if you all think, having just, that was last week, if I'm not losing track of time completely, do you think that having more of those voices, Elizabeth, if you're saying that there were workers present, or I don't know how much you all paid attention to the summit, but did you see the presence of a greater diversity of voices changing the conversation in a significant enough way? Was it like resulting in, in talks about this, the overconsumption and overproduction and like these bigger questions, or was it more tokenistic, do you think?
I think organizations such as Copenhagen's, or, these kind of massive global events are designed for a scope. And at the end of the scope is to for them to pat each other on the back and say all the great things that they've said and then repeat the year after. So, but they do closely follow the cultural barometer. And yes, according to the cultural barometer this year, we saw a sufficient amount of potential. I mean, the point is that, what are those conversations, but in many ways, marketing exercises. They seem to me to be very much about presenting things that have been done too slowly, rather than really challenging things that ought to happen very, very quickly. I think what is important is to try and, what I would personally would like to see is somehow some smaller micro events that are dedicated at really solving things where things need to be solved, in charged by the people that are, confronting those issues. It's a multitude of issues that affect the fashion industry, from the deepest technology to the garment worker, to the supply chain workers, to the models, the us, how we perceive ourselves through fashion. So it's such a wide conversation. But to really understand how these big organizations run, I think, to me, is that they are, that they're a barometer of the time, and more often than not, they come lacking of that real push for innovation that we really, really want to see.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's helpful to also think about things in terms of, size and agility. So, I mean, we have this kind of terrible comparison, but if you look at some things of some organizations are much, I'm talking about, larger brands and whatnot, are much more like a ocean liner. So they can change directions. It just takes a heck of a long time to do so. And it can be challenging, and it takes a lot of kind of, charting for that. Whereas you have others that are a bit maybe like a sailboat or something, where it's a bit more agile. So I think that when you have these convening moments, they are really interesting, because at the end of the day, everyone's kind of looking at each other, seeing what's going on, and that does influence behavior. So I think there is certainly a benefit to be gleaned from that. And oftentimes, if you don't have these moments of pulling people together, we're not even having conversations like this, right? So it does kind of help facilitate a further discussion. But yeah, just a way that
I think my concern with Copenhagen is once the fashion industry got really interested in sustainability, because there's so much money behind conferences like that, it's almost like they end up shaping the agenda and the conversation, and it's shaped in a very particular way, right? Like it's, they kind of have the ability to create this perception that things are changing. Just because there's so much money and power behind these events. I feel like 10 years ago, it was just more of like the ethical and sustainable fashion movement felt more independent. And now that brands are really involved in the conversation, it's almost like, it feels like our community is like constantly having to battle the messaging that they're putting out and figuring out what parts of what they're saying are accurate. If their carbon plan is well-intentioned, or if it's mostly greenwashing, it creates like so much noise that's really, really difficult to cut through.
The thing with Copenhagen has always been the audience. For me, the people on stage were always by far the least interesting. And this is when we could attend live. And ultimately, this is why I valued it, you know, when it was still okay to fly. And, you know, for those of us who took the onus to actually fly in order to go somewhere, also knowing that flying into this type of event isn't necessarily the best thing, but there was something to be made by the people. And I think that this is, you know, this is the issue that to a certain extent, sustainable fashion has, it's what I was trying to say before. We've ended up emulating precisely what we're looking to antagonize. I mean, the one thing that I'm proud of the fashion revolution is it not being at all, never having been celebrity focused. We've always been from the bottom up. We've always been about our audience, the people that follow us, and that's the message that counts. The garment workers, you know, when we launched our first hashtag, Who Made My Clothes, that in a year we had the I Made Your Clothes spontaneously with supply chain workers wanting to be a part of the conversation. And this is, I think, what's missing. You know, we keep doing this thing of putting these great big heroes up at the top. I mean, you know, during one Copenhagen, somebody called, you know, the name now is gone, but, you know, a hero, and he's like, Pinot, you're no hero, you're a, you know.
I remember that moment. It was so awkward.
Wait, who was called a hero?
It was the guy that was the head of what is curing. You're a hero. Can I just say you are a hero? And the entire auditorium was like, really awkward. Really awkward.
Applauded, like silence in the room.
Wow, I missed that one. Okay.
But I agree with Orsola, though. I do think I went to Copenhagen last year. This year, if I was going to go, I was going to take the roundabout way and maybe like stop in Berlin. So take the train instead of flying. But I do think it is about connecting with other people, because there's a lot of great people that do come to that event, and generally you listen to a few talks and then everybody breaks and you're like, did you think that was nonsense? Yeah, I did too. What are you working on? You trade cards, but yeah, it's not exactly always about what's going on the big stage.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about kind of consumer research. You know, there's a lot of surveys showing consumers want sustainability, but then, you know, the behavior doesn't always line up with that. Recent research has found that consumers want more durable items and to keep items longer. What are your thoughts on that specific, you know, notion, that concept that consumers want to keep things longer, and what's the role of consumer research in general in driving this conversation?
I'm okay to go with the durability and the lasting longer. I have a book coming out on the 11th of February, and it's called Loved Clothes Last, which is also a hashtag that long before it was a hashtag, I used to describe the clothes when I made clothes. And, you know, so this whole relationship between us and our clothes, really, we've been robbed of it after 30, 40 years of cheap clothes, you know, robbed. We've brought, you know, bringing up a generation that doesn't understand quality. They wouldn't know the difference between a hemming and an overlocking. You know, they don't touch fabrics and feel that, you know, feeling. And that's a huge missing vast part of culture. And let's call it also female culture that has been eradicated for the sake of very, very cheap clothing that comes to the expense of people and planet. So thank God people are looking at durability again as a vital asset and something to look forward to, because actually, and this is where I call the luxury into question, as everybody always talks about fast fashion, but luxury has completely made us forget what handmade looks like, what, you know, a drop of blood on a hemline looks like. They've glossified everything and called it. And that was meant to be quality and durability, made in the same factory clusters as many premium or cheap products, equally in, you know, toxicant materials and so on and so forth. So the importance, this is the one place where citizens can really play an important part in changing this culture two ways. I mean, you know, the first one is what you can do for yourself, because obviously the more affluent can decide to buy one good product that will last, and avoid the cheap that won't. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the great majority can't. And that, again, it's the brand's responsibility to provide them with just as good a quality product, because they too have to keep it for a long time, even if it was inexpensive. And just as, some of us can sit in front of YouTube and learn how to sew and learn how to mend, other of us need to campaign so that there are mending stations in every bloody supermarket, so that, single parents with young kids can go and have their uniforms mended for a fraction of the price, precisely from one of those brands that sold them the crap in the first place. So, that's what I call the responsibility needs to come from brand, because we can't put demand and then action all on people who often are struggling, comparatively to other people that are struggling. So this is massive responsibility for the brand. Consumer research is dodgy, but the quest for durability is something that we need to look at a demand and make it completely embedded in our culture.
I also think, though, because of how much product has been generally pushed on your average citizen, people have gotten away from the idea of like just investing in something that you're really going to love. Like that's what fast fashion does. It forces us to devalue everything. I mean, right now, everyone's coming back to this notion of secondhand clothing, like it's a new thing, but like that's the only way I've ever been able to afford luxury goods. Like, and it wasn't cool to talk about that. I wasn't like advertising when I was in college that like, oh yeah, I got this, like I got my designer jeans on eBay. Like that would have gotten me so made fun of. But like now it's like, it's trendy and that's great, but we should have been there all along. And when you do sort of invest in something, invest in like the products that you like, and you spend a lot of time looking for that sort of thing online, you get really interested in this brand. Why am I interested in this brand? Why do I want this product? Is this product actually better, or am I wanting this product because a fashion magazine told me I should want this product? So I've found that through my own weird way of learning how to shop, learning about the fashion industry, it's pushed me in this direction. But that's always been the way I've shopped, because it wasn't like I was born into a wealthy family. It wasn't like my parents. I've been buying my own clothing since I was 11, and that was because my mom just did not understand, like, can I please just have a t-shirt from the Gap? Like that was all I wanted when I was 11. And my mom was like, Kmart's good enough for me and it's good enough for you. But these sort of conversations and getting very interested in the fashion industry helped me to get to this place. But like a part of that history was sort of trolling online spaces for like the just right product. And I found, because I was putting in that sort of energy into my shopping, I was also really loving that thing for a very long amount of time.
So that seems like a good answer for on a personal level, like the individual level for the last question before we get to audience questions. But looking more broadly, how do we address the addiction, that like the sort of addictive nature that people have with fast fashion? Sounds like what you're talking about, Aja, is like exactly sort of getting to that point, how in your own sort of like evolution. Do you all have thoughts on, how to sort of, address the addiction more on a broader scale, on a larger scale?
Yeah, so I'll use our experience, which is our fancy way of saying museum, as an example. And it's just one small example, right? It's a physical experience here in Amsterdam, and you can do a lot of interaction with it now digitally. But so what we've tried to do, and the intention behind that, was to really change the hearts and minds of consumers, but doing it through a enlightening process. So, as you move through the experience, you learn about why it is that we got here, right? What happened? What are the major moments that happened in history that's led to our current state? And then we talk about what does the future look like, right? So there's really cool interactive, you can, play with some new raw materials or, see a dress that was dyed using some kind of microbial dye, et cetera. So I think what we've tried to do is create curiosity and create a space where you can learn and you can facilitate and have those experiences. And luckily, I think we've landed quite a market. And also I'm happy to report that a lot of our visitors are students. So I think that gives us a lot of hope for the future. But so I think creating, this is just one example, it's one physical space in Amsterdam, but through our digital community and online and whatnot, we hope to at least put the spotlight on it and create more awareness around it so that folks can have these conversations and recognize and explore what are alternatives, right? If we know this is broken, what are different ways we can go about it? What are some solutions that we can try to kind of not just patch things up, but really drive it in the right direction forward? So I think that maybe gets to half of the question you asked, but maybe I'll pause and let someone else jump in.
Yeah, does anyone else?
I feel like in the US, we have so much work to do around this issue. Like I know in Europe, there's more countries, to my understanding, where there's incentives for secondhand and repair shops. Like there's actually support for the infrastructure for reuse. And there are more educational campaigns around conscious consumption. So it's not just something that's pursued on an individual level. There's actually kind of a public understanding of like, here's a way to cut your carbon footprint or cut down on waste simply by rewearing what you already have. I really don't, New York has done some interesting public campaigns around textile waste. I believe that was a partnership with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, but we really need more of things like that. Because right now it's kind of all on the consumer to fix, like that we're supposed to really understand that fast fashion is not good and that we should pursue durable clothes. But I feel like people need more support to make those transitions more meaningful.
I would agree. I think ultimately the culture of what we've all existed in, because we were definitely all born into this sort of capitalism, has to ultimately change. And I try and do that on my platform. I tell people all the time, I'm like, I hope you like this dress because you're going to see it a lot. And I do think that, the culture of influencer particularly, influencer is a dirty word in a lot of ways. And I don't like when people call me that because I'm not selling people hordes of utter shite. And some people have done that for a while. And I think seeing that sort of shift on social media where it's not actually looking cool anymore to wear something new every single time you're on Instagram, I think that is super duper important to the conversation. I mean, I have a 13-year-old niece and she feels like she always needs to buy new things. And so it's got to be a cultural shift. I mean, I don't want to put all the onus on the citizen, but I think ultimately we've been sold a faulty bill of goods. And in order for the stores to stop creating a supply, the demand sort of has to lessen. But I do see that happening. I do. But I think we just kind of have to make some things uncool. And a lot of those things have been so entrenched in our culture. Like when you watch a movie and there's some sort of like shopping montage and stuff like that, like that starts quite young being sort of put into our brains. And I think we have to have a conversation about that ultimately and have a shift in a different direction.
Yeah.
We had amazing success with our Black Friday campaign last year. And I think in a way that was really encouraging because we basically faced the beast. And we brought to our audience and our followers as much information as we possibly could find around the fact that it is a lie, that actually those goods were discounted all year long, that at the end of the day, the more you were bargain hunting during Black Friday, the less you were making a saving. It was just time and energy badly spent. And I think that when you really confront people with when consumption becomes Monty Python, grotesque in its manifestation, that, and you provide them with some really solid evidence. For instance, we started telling our community, you know, guys, do you know that returns are not resold? Every time you buy 4 sizes to choose and pick and choose which one will fit you better because they're all discounted by 79%, each one that you send back is practically chucked. And people just don't make these calculations in their head anymore. You know, they don't think why before they buy, not at all. And so I feel that we do have to confront the beast when it rears ugly head as it does during these so-called celebrations, so-called festivities of what? Of our own demise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point to sort of address.
Aja had a really good idea too earlier about, you know, sustainable education in schools. I met someone at an event back when we did stuff in person who said that their kid was learning, it was some sort of like modern home ec class where they were learning how to consume sustainably. I don't really know more about the details, but that's a really interesting idea too.
Mm-hmm.
And will be completely necessary for us to fix some of this stuff.
Right. Let's there's some good questions from the audience. So I just want to get to a few of them. Getting back to overproduction. And whoever asked this is what my story is about tomorrow. So it's very top of mind for me. How do we balance asking brands to slow down production while not destroying the livelihoods of the factory workers who depend on this production for their livelihoods? Does anyone want to take that?
Well, I kind of said it a little bit before that we need to look at quality of product and quality of life. I mean, you know, these people are abused. These people are not paid fairly, and taking away jobs from them not buying clothes is not the equivalent of taking away jobs from them. You know, boycotting a brand, often a brand has boycott included already in their profit and loss because, you know, it's something that they know will happen. What is important is that brands have a responsibility to pay their supply chain, and it's their responsibility to redirect margins that they make towards supply chain workers. I don't remember the statistic, but if you do go on our Fashion Revolution Instagram feed, at some point you will see a t-shirt. In that t-shirt, which is all kind of embroidered, you see Fairtrade has done a study on actually the percentage of the impact of the price of a t-shirt actually going to the garment worker, and it's absolutely minute. So we go back to the very, very beginning. This is an economic question. I go back to Aja. You know, this economic system is not working because ultimately the profits are very, very, very unequally redistributed.
Yeah. So do the people at the top, I would say. Like, look at your favorite company and like ask who their owner is, and then just look up their net worth. It's really easy to find. And if the brand says, oh, but we can't make a promise that everyone's making living wage, ask them why their owner makes so much money then. Like, quite frankly, I think in a fair fashion world, I don't think that any of these people would be billionaires. I think maybe they would be wealthy, but the amount of profit that has been made from the system is outrageous. And I think there's starting to be a bit of a conversation about, you know, what that sort of wealth looks like and why it's kind of a little bit unethical. And so when brands say that they can't ensure a living wage is paid, then how do you ensure that so many people make so much money on this end of the scale? And so I don't think that it's a question of whether or not we boycott. I think it's a question of fairness. There's this conversation about the race to the bottom in the fashion industry. We need to start discouraging that. That's not a good practice to walk into a situation where you are from a, you know, economically, you know, very well off country, and you're walking into a traditionally pillaged country and people that are, you know, dependent because of colonialism on these systems, and then going, oh, what's the lowest price you can offer us for a dress? That sort of stuff needs to be discouraged. And so I don't think, once again, that's on the consumer. That's on the unfairness of how the system continues to progress, and us sort of starting to say this is not a good system.
Right. I want to jump in just to get to that question a little more specifically just because, again, it's just on my mind, having talked to a bunch of people about it in the last week. I'll just say, I mean, there is a little bit of work, and certainly not enough on upskilling and reskilling. The one organization that really, and this is why Fashion for Good is on it to some degree. That's why I talked to Brittany the other day. And there's an organization called Shimmy that has been working with women using they've developed a gaming platform to help women garment workers increase their skills, so that as jobs, even in the pandemic, but also as like if production does decrease and jobs do become more scarce, they are more employable, basically, and the according to Shimmy, the first group of women that they trained currently still has jobs. All of the women in that first cohort have jobs, whereas there have obviously been a lot of layoffs in the industry since the pandemic, but because they have more skills, like in this specific case, they learned to operate multiple sewing machines at once, whereas in these regions the average is one, and so that has made them more employable. And then the other and then Orsola, you talked about profit, sharing margins, or like having I guess diverting some of the margins to elsewhere in the supply chain. That was someone made the point that is sort of like there's even more chance to do that. I mean, there's also the billions, the disparity it provides that opportunity, but also with resale, as garments are, there's multiple sales for one single garment, and so there seems someone was sort of proposing that there are like technology solutions for being able to share that multiple generation of value with more people in the supply chain. So
well, I can add something about this question of upskilling and whether or not that's an answer for the labor rights challenges in fashion. What we saw in the pandemic was people getting laid off, and they were immediately destitute and hungry. And the reason is simply because they're not being paid enough money. And, to Aja's point and Orsola's point, and our community, like that can't be acceptable. You've got brands making billions of dollars in profits every year, and people in their factories are making a fifth of a living wage. And there was this narrative when outsourcing first started happening that labor rights were just going to magically get better, the free hand of the marketplace was going to work, and, over time, working conditions would improve. And that has not happened in most apparel producing countries. So, a living wage is like a non-negotiable must for the industry coming out of the pandemic. Like, it's not okay anymore. People lost their jobs and then starved. Like, in what universe is that acceptable? It's not acceptable.
To tag on to your point, I always say that, in American civics, like 8th grade, you learn about like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and everyone's like, and that's why we have regulation in America, because that'll never happen again. When in actuality, we just outsource the problem somewhere else, and that still happens. And so, yeah.
Okay, we are pretty much out of time. I think there are a couple questions that we didn't get to, but if we can just do one last question, we can sort of, and everyone can take just a quick shot at the question. And it's very broad, but it comes up all the time. So I think it's a good thing to end on and sort of just address, is there such a thing as conscious consumerism, or is it a myth? That's probably not a 10-second answer for everyone, but if I think let's just kind of go around and this can be our sort of wrap up thought.
I'll kick it off with something very like a brief response to that. So I think there is a thing. I think the definition of it is evolving and it's fluid. You know, I think there's much work still to be done, but I think it is something that does exist. Maybe that's too optimistic, but that's how I feel.
Okay.
Paradoxically, if actually we were consumers, we wouldn't have this problem, because the actual word consumer, from Latin consumere, means to wear out, to wear until it's broken, to wear until death. So at the end of the day, if only we were what we have been described as.
What an interesting point. Okay, great. Elizabeth or Aja? Elizabeth, you're muted. Yeah.
Oh, I just wrote a story for Atmos about ethical consumerism. I am sorting through my feelings about it right now and my thoughts, and most of them are in that story if you're interested in reading about it. But in short, I think that consumers we have a lot of power, but I think that we need to shift the way that we use it towards making change that benefits everyone. So instead of privatizing social change and asking people to shift the stores that they shop in, really targeting the system so that those changes are available to everyone.
I think until we live in a society where we can choose whether or not to wear clothing, you have to dress yourself. And so, you know, it's about making the best decision for you at your socioeconomic scale. I get that not one can afford the top of the line, but we have so much clothing on planet Earth, and there are more like fashion resale sites popping up every day. So like get on that. But more than anything, like learn your style, learn what it is that you like so that you don't feel compelled to have to like buy new things often. And so that you feel really happy when you look at your wardrobe, because once you get there, then you don't really get caught up in the whole, I have to buy something new once a month. So it's a lot of moving parts, but you still got to buy clothing. So just do your best.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. This was such a good conversation. Thanks for joining.
Bye, everybody. Thank you,
Bye.
Brittany. Thank you for moderating, Rachel.
Thank you, everyone. It was nice to meet some of you face to face.